Hello, and welcome to the first lecture in our public health microbiology course. This is covering the information in chapter 1, a brief history of microbiology. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but it's kind of important stuff. To understand what this class is all about, you have to understand what microorganisms are and what we call disease. So what we mean by microorganisms or microbes, I'll use those two terms interchangeably. They're living things that are too small to see without a microscope. That's where the micro part comes in. And then not all microbes cause disease. Some of them live in our bodies and we absolutely required having them, for example, in our guts. But some of them interfere with correct functioning of our physiology, that is, that it causes a departure from homeostasis. That's what we call disease or dis-ease. Like I said, not all of them make us sick. And on top of that, not all diseases are caused by microorganisms. So this class is only going to focus on that area where you see overlap. So we've got all these different kinds of microorganisms. Many of them have absolutely nothing to do with humans. You'll never find something in the archaea living on a human being. But there are some microorganisms that do live on humans and also don't cause disease. And then you do have some human diseases that are caused by microorganisms. Most human diseases in this country are not caused by infection, but worldwide, microbes do cause a lot of illness and death. So that is what we're focusing on in this class, is where we've got microbes causing human disease. Little historical background. I'm going to have to remind you of some stuff that you may have learned a long time ago in biology. Carl Linnaeus developed this method of naming and classifying living organisms. We still use this today with some modifications. So I'm going to remind you, in Linnaeus's day, he had the biggest categories that he worked with were kingdoms. And he divided everything into these two kingdoms, plants and animals. Then he also had subdivisions, phyla. Then there's class, order, remember this, family, genus, species. And after Linnaeus, then there was a third kingdom added, because we had some things that were, they were like plants in that they didn't move around, but they were like animals in that they could get their nutrients from other things, breaking down other things. That is, fungi are not photosynthetic the way plants are, but they are stationary the way plants are. So that was put into another category. And then there was this giant group that was all shoved into this one kingdom, the Protista. And then again, with the Protista, these are single-celled organisms. Some of them are more like animals. We call those the protozoa. And some of them are more like plants. These are the algae. And then there was this great big kingdom that was kind of a hodgepodge of things. Again, this was referred to as Monera, these were single-celled organisms. But after a time, it became obvious that the things that were being shoved into this one category, this category cannot contain them. And so we did away with the kingdom Monera and instead created another category of group of organisms that's even higher than the level of kingdom. And the reason for this is that there were two groups in this single-celled organisms, and those two groups were more different from each other than plants and animals are from each other. So that gives you some idea. And so the domains that were created were bacteria and archaea. And bacteria are the ones that you're familiar with. Some of them can cause disease in humans. Archaea are single-celled organisms that live in really extreme conditions, like hydrothermal vents, like the the hot springs, Yellowstone. I mean, really, really extreme conditions. And then everything else, these were all the organisms, plants, animals, fungi, everything that used to be classified as protists. These are all cellular organisms that have a nucleus. That's where the eukarya comes from. Karya is a kernel or nucleus, and eu means good or true. Now, there is no such thing as a superdomain, but I'm going to make it up here because there's a term that you've probably heard before and you don't quite know where to put it here. And so I'm going to just create this category, superdomain. And yeah, I made it up. But this is where this term goes. Prokaryotes, you've heard of them as organisms that are different from eukaryotes, right? They don't have a nucleus. They evolved before a nucleus evolved. And then everything else that has a nucleus, we call those the eukaryotes. Okay. So these three main domains of life, let me go back for a second. We're talking about bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. This is another representation of the same information. And you can see that bacteria are off on their own. The archaea are somewhere between the bacteria and the eukaryotes in their evolutionary history. So eukaryotes and archaea have a more recent common ancestor than we do with bacteria. And this is another representation of the same thing. We've got these, this group up, this is the tiny picture of these three domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And then we're going to zero in on eukarya down here. And what I'm representing here are the three of the kingdoms. The first two were plants and animals, right? And then we said, okay, and then we created this group, fungi, because that's where a lot of organisms went. And then everything else that you see, all these endpoints, these all used to be smushed together into that grouping, protozoa. Now, more recently, things have been discovered, infectious agents, and you've heard of them. It's not like this is brand new information, but they're a little bit weird. So these infectious agents, they're acellular. They're not made from cells the way every other living thing is. So we have viruses. Then we have something called viroids. And finally, prions. These are the weirdest of them all. And we'll go over this later. But I just putting this into this category, these categories. I have trouble talking about this because there are, I like to use the word organism for bacteria. But, bacteria and fungi, but viruses, viroids, and prions, they're not really living, which is what we mean by the term organism. And so I'm just going to say these things have led some people to suggest that we need another taxonomic rank that's bigger than domain. So we would have viruses, viroids, and prions on one side, and then we would have everything else that we had talked about on the previous slide over here by itself. And so everything over here on the left, these things are made of cells, including the bacteria and the archaea. Although they don't have a nucleus, they do have a cell membrane around the outside, that phospholipid bilayer, blah, blah, blah. All right, so it's been suggested that we use empire as another rank, and that these are cells. So like cyto refers to cells, so cytota, these are the cellular organisms. And then acytota, these are the non-cellular things. And some of these non-cellular things can cause disease in humans. And so we're going to talk about some of these. Again, this is another representation of the same kind of thing. The infectious agents that are non-cellular are over here on the right. And then, oh, and the term, sometimes people say they're non-living because none of these things can reproduce on their own. They're absolutely obligate parasites. They absolutely have to reproduce inside other organisms. And over on the left, we have the living organisms. Okay. What are the two types of prokaryotic organisms? And I'll give you a moment. Go ahead and pause the recording and think to yourself, which of these two types prokaryotic organisms? Look back at your notes if you need to. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's the bacteria and the archaea, then you are absolutely correct. These are the prokaryotes. They don't have nuclei in their cells, but they are cellular. All right, another one. All of these microorganisms that we talked about, all the bacteria and archaea, they cause disease. And that one shouldn't be too hard. This one is false. The vast majority of bacteria and archaea have nothing to do with humans whatsoever, and they do not cause disease. We are going to focus on that minority of microorganisms that can make humans sick. I'm going to pause here and start a separate recording. See you back in part 2. I'm going to do something. Pause recording.